My name is AJ Adelikhan, and this is the group project for the Iranian Green Movement. First, let's dive into Iran's political structure. Iran has three branches of power: the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. Iran also has a republic as a political system. Despite that fact, the majority of the power is held between the supreme leader and the Council of Guardians. These positions have the power to veto any other policy made by any other positions. The Iranian population can elect the president, the parliament, and the assembly of experts. The assembly of experts have the power to appoint the supreme leader. The Iranian population has no direct influence on any decision making made by the supreme leader or the Guardian Council. Before the 2009 presidential election, President Ahmadinejad had an unsuccessful first term. Inflation and unemployment rose drastically. Despite the masses not favoring President Ahmadinejad, the Supreme Leader and the Guardian Council favored him because of his foreign policy. In the Iranian government, they value the Islamic religion very highly. There is no separation of church and state. This goes into the economy of Iran. Iran relies heavily on crude oil production. And in 2009, the Iranian government moved towards a petroleum sector in their economy. This would attract foreign investment by Russia and China, which would bolster the Iranian financial system. This move was seen as strictly a financial move for Iran. Iran, before this move, was very vulnerable on international oil prices. As I said before, in Ahmadinejad's first term, unemployment and inflation was high, and this was the major reason why the Iranian population did not favor Ahmadinejad anymore. Due to the global financial crisis during 2008 and 2009, the international oil prices affected the Iranian economy drastically. Society in Iran is very different than most other Middle Eastern countries. The language of Iran is Farsi, juxtaposed to Arabic and most other Middle Eastern countries. 90% of the population in Iran are Shia Muslims. This is drastically different than most other Middle Eastern countries because most other Middle Eastern countries are Sunni Muslims. This is why Iran has a lot of feuds with Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries because they are Sunni Muslims. Sunni and Shia Muslims have had very bad relations over centuries because of the fundamentals of the Islamic religion. Though religion is used and encouraged by the Supreme Leader and the Guardian Council, the majority of the population does not practice the religion. It is said that 70% of the population does not perform daily prayers, and it is said that 2% attend Friday mosques. It is seen and evident that there is a major disconnect between the youth and the elderly in Iran. The youth value education and are much more educated than previous generations in Iran. The younger generation also does not go to church or their mosques as frequently as older generations do or have. Despite the young people being very educated, the technology in Iran is not even comparable to what it is in the West. In most other Middle Eastern countries, there's a movement to modernize their technology and their political structure. But in Iran, that is not even a question. Technology is not at the center or forefront for the governing body in Iran. Due to the decline and the decrease in economic production in Iran, it is said that every other 25 to 29-year-old in Iran was unemployed in 2007. Iran is a very large country, a very prideful country. Today, there are around 82 million Iranians. The Iranian military is regarded as one of the most powerful militaries in the country, and especially in the Middle East. The head of the military, or the group that influences the military of Iran the most, is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They have heavy influence on seemingly every part of the Iranian culture, its politics, its media, and its executive powers. The IRGC is very close to the supreme leader of Iran. So as the 2009 election approached, in typical IRGC fashion, they threatened the opposing candidate, presidential candidate Mousavi, in a way that was common in most other elections in Iran. They did not guarantee peace for Mousavi in a way that was many regard as a threat. They said that Mousavi would not receive any protection and basically was encouraging an attack on Mousavi after the election. The people saw this as an outright threat and were disgusted by these remarks, even though this was typical in IRGC fashion. The 2009 election highlighted a lot of drastically new issues in Iran and its culture. This was the first televised election in Iran, which is equivalent to our Kennedy versus Nixon first televised election in America. The people saw Mousavi as a reformist and as a person who can return some of the ideals that most of the people, most of the population in Iran valued. They saw President Ahmadinejad as a person who would just continue the conservative nature of the supreme leader and the Guardian Council and all of their ideologies. 39 million votes were cast, which was the largest turnout in Iranian history. This election, the result of it, was shocking to most of the Iranians because they thought that it would be a resounding victory for Mousavi over Ahmadinejad, but the opposite happened. It was seen that it was a rigged election, and this was mainly because of the supreme leader's power to veto any decision, any election in Iran. The supreme leader took it into his own hands to control the election because he favored Ahmadinejad along with the IRGC favoring Ahmadinejad over Mousavi. And this was a total violation of all voting rights in the Iranian political system. So after months of intense debate, personal debates, personal arguments against each other, Ahmadinejad won via a rigged election by the supreme leader of Iran.
Iran's Green Movement began on June 12, 2009, when Iranians flocked to the polls to vote in the presidential election between incumbent President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and 3 other challengers, among who was popular Mir Hossein Mousavi. The turnout was reportedly 85%. Ahmadinejad represented a hard-line conservative stance, whereas Mousavi was a reformist contender and the main oppositionist leader. Many Iranians were angry and dubious of the electoral results released on June 13th, which reinstated Ahmadinejad's presidency and suspected voter fraud. However, the street politics and protests to come were due to a long-established resentment of the political status quo, which included daily surveillance, government corruption, authoritarian rule, and growing youth unemployment. On June 13th, with 80% of the ballots counted, Iran's government announced that Ahmadinejad won the presidential elections with 62.63% of the vote, whereas Mousavi received 33.75% of the vote. Immediately after the announcement, thousands took to the streets in protest, claiming the vote was rigged, and protested for a re-election. Although protests were initially peaceful, they became increasingly rowdy. Furious crowds in the capital ransacked shops, ripped signs, and started fires. Demonstrators chanted, "Down with the dictator, death to the dictator, and give us our votes back." CNN reported that street protesters and the riot police clashed, and that the former threw stones towards the latter. The demonstrators were largely Mousavi supporters, but observers informed journalists that later that night, that Ahmadinejad's supporters arrived on the scene and began to face off against the Mousavi supporters in Tehran's Mohseni Square. On June 15th, in what had been the largest protest since the 1979 revolution at the time, a reported 3 million Mousavi's supporters marched in Tehran, defying warnings from state officials that such a gathering would be considered illegal with legal repercussions. Many wore green, the color of Mousavi's campaign. Mousavi also appeared for the first time since June 12th and called for the electoral results to be annulled. Protesters clashed with the police and 8 people were reported dead. On the 16th, the Guardian Council declared a partial recount, while thousands marched again in Tehran's streets. However, Mousavi rejected the partial recount, arguing that everything had already been tainted, and called for new elections entirely. Support for the Green Movement was also shown in various ways. During a World Cup qualifying match, the captain of Iran's football team and some other teammates were pictured with green armbands indicating their support. Meanwhile, Iran's Ministry of Culture issued a ban on any reporting from foreign media from the streets of Tehran. On the 19th, Supreme Leader Khamenei made his first public appearance post-election and claimed that the difference in votes between the candidates, some 11 million votes, was too great to be faked. He stated that the opposition leaders would be responsible for bloodshed and chaos if they continued supporting the protests. On June 20th, the riot police did not hold back in responding to the oppositionists, who were in open defiance of Khamenei's warnings, and the state-run media reported that at least 10 were killed and 100 injured. June 20th, 2009 would eventually be known as Black Saturday. One of the dead included a 26-year-old Iranian, Neda Agha Soltan, who became a symbol of the opposition. Soltan was shot by the Basij, one of the 5 forces of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and died on camera. Her brutal death spread virally throughout social media. Around the world, protests took place in New York City, Los Angeles, in front of the White House, in Paris, and in Brussels. Over the next week, protesters continued to clash with the police, while journalists continued to be barred from reporting on the streets. The Supreme Leader continued to strongly reject any of the opposition's requests to hold a new election. On August 5th, Ahmadinejad was sworn in for his second time as the country's president, while protests raged on outside the parliament, chanting "Death to the dictator." Some oppositionist leaders and former presidents, along with all of Ahmadinejad's election challengers, did not attend the inauguration, as a sign of support for the Green Movement. Fresh protests restarted on Quds Day, an annual day of solidarity with the Palestinians, on September 18th. Thousands of protesters rallied and continued venting their anger. Regardless of the warnings from Iran's police chief, protesters wore green and bore the slogan Quds Day, Green Day. November 4th marks the anniversary of the student takeover of the U.S. Embassy in 1979 and is a state holiday for Iran. Students customarily get time off from attending school, and their schools drive them to the old American Embassy compound for an assembly and an official ceremony. However, instead of chanting "Death to America" as encouraged by the government officials, protesters and attendants shouted "Death to the dictator," agreeing Iran doesn't need nuclear weapons, and also for the first time chanted against Supreme Leader Khamenei. The Basij reacted disproportionately and attacked protesters with clubs and tear gas. Several were hospitalized, and the Iranian government reported that officials arrested 109 protesters. On December 19th, one of the more prominent leaders of the movement, Grand Ayatollah Hossein Ali Montazeri, passed, and his death characterized a significant loss for the reformers. His funeral was held on the 21st, in which protesters mourned wearing green and protested against the government once more. On December 27th, major protests by oppositionist supporters broke out again. The day of Ashura is very symbolic on the Shiite calendar, as it is considered as the holiest day of the year. However, on this day, riot police opened fire on protesters and used tear gas. The state media reported a total of 15 dead, which signified December 27th as the deadliest day in the entire movement since the June protests. Among the dead was Mousavi's nephew. Pro-government rallies also took place, such as this one on December 30th. In 2010, the Green Movement attempted to mobilize protesters for February 11th, the anniversary of the Shah regime's collapse, but the government crackdown was so severe and brutal that the movement's leaders had to stop the demonstration. Afterwards, public rallies were essentially finished. Although the movement briefly delegitimized Ahmadinejad's regime, it could not endure the continuous and unstoppable crackdowns from the riot police. The movement also suffered from a decentralized organization and the leaders' reluctance to directly confront the incumbent conservative elite prohibited any real results. These challenges contributed to the movement's disintegration and consequently its disappearance. However, as the 2013 electoral victory of reformist President Hassan Rouhani shows, the Green Movement was not at all unsuccessful, and its demands and goals are capable of influencing the political sphere in Iran.
Moving on to the policy recommendation in regards to the current situation in Iran, it's important to reiterate that the Green Movement of 2009 and today's protests are not equivalent. The Green Movement was not in and of itself a revolution. Its goal was not to ultimately topple the regime. It was to end the corruption that caused the rigged elections leading up to President Ahmadinejad's re-election. Today's protests are largely anti-regime and have resulted in far more violence from the part of the protesters than during the Green Movement. It is for this reason that I believe employing a lot of the ideals of the Green Movement today could be largely beneficial for protesters in Iran in their goal to dismantle the regime. First and foremost, the largely nonviolent disposition brought upon by the Green Movement's leaders is a powerful tool. I believe I think that nonviolence is the optimal tool towards dismantling oppressive regimes. And other talking points brought up, for example, repeated insistence against economic sanctions that cripple the lives of millions of Iranians, opposition to covert operations or military strikes against Iran, talking points that that were strong pillars of the Green Movement should also be brought into today's protest, because these measures aimed to hurt the government are largely hurting the civilians that need the most help. Additionally, there are a variety of other structural differences between the Green Movement and today's protests, differences which can cause concern when thinking about the prospects for success in toppling the regime today. Most importantly, the Green Movement had a strong political position. Everyone was protesting against the rigged elections. The protesters rallied around the slogan, "Where is my vote?" Instead, when looking at today's protest, there's a variety of different reasons and a variety of different goals depending on who you talk to. Some people are protesting rampant corruption. Other people protested the inflation of oil prices, or even the inflation of consumer goods such as eggs, for example. If the movement were able to kind of solidify and build maybe either a set list of demands or just a generalized vision, that could help a lot in making this struggle far more effective. Additionally, there was a sort of leadership during the Green Movement that is not really seen today. Mousavi, the candidate who lost the 2009 election, was the de facto leader of the Green Movement, and while he was subject to house arrest, along with his wife and closest allies, the idea of someone leading today's protest could also help rally other people, or even just have one voice that can really show the demands of the people. However, obviously, since the protests today are far more anti-regime, you couldn't have someone like Mousavi be the leader this time around, given that he is part of the regime. He was running to be president within this regime. You need someone who stands for what the people want. When looking back at social movements over the last 10 to 15 years, it's important to note how social media played a role not only in helping the movement expand within the borders of a country, but also getting movement's messages out to the international community and helping drum up support and pressure on oppressive forces throughout the world. In 2017, when protests broke out in Iran, Telegram and Instagram were two huge platforms used to getting the word out to different cities throughout the country and getting different protests started. It's for this reason, and stemming back even before that the government has been slowly weaning themselves off of kind of the global internet, one could say, and kind of having their own sovereign network that they can kind of control at all times. During the protests in 2009, during the Green Movement, Iran used bandwidth throttling, which while the country was still online, it made connectivity speeds incredibly slow and really did damage to the power that that social media could bring. And this power has really only kind of grown over the years. Looking at 2017 and 2018, the government started blocking specific applications such as Instagram, such as Telegram, and then afterwards imposed a near total blackout at times. The internet connectivity throughout the country was about 8% of what it should be. So protesters need to find a way to plan around this eventuality whenever the government deems it fit to take down internet connectivity. And they have taken steps to do so. For example, creating the application Hafez, which not only serves as a database for human rights lawyers throughout Iran, it also does give human rights news updates relevant to the context of the country. So obviously, social media is an incredibly powerful tool. As Kevyan Rafi said, a very prominent Iranian activist, free and uncensored circulation of information opens the society to changes and accelerates the process of democratization. Another thing that could become an essential tool for the Iranian people in their struggle against the regime could be the implementation of the Iranian diaspora as allies for the protesters. While obviously there are opposing groups amongst migrants, as in there are opposing groups within Iranian civil society, there must still be a large population of migrants who are anti-regime, and potentially even people who left Iran to escape the regime, giving them great reason to help the protesters in any capacity. They would serve as crucial mediators for any form of media that can come out of the country during the protests, whether it be refuting state-sponsored propaganda that could be implemented to disparage protesters and call them violent or thugs or whatever thing the government may try to do, or whether it be helping spread videos of police brutality or of some of the oppressive tactics that the government has unleashed upon its citizens. This sort of mediation could become even more important than in a normal social movement, given that the Iranian government does have the capacity to shut down their country's internet connectivity at the drop of a hat. So any way, if people can get their content out to maybe family members or friends or just people in the diaspora, then the people living outside of Iran, outside of the reach of the government, could then share this information, share this content with the outside world during moments when the Iranian civilians can't do it themselves. In regards to the policy recommendation for the Iranian government, the optimal situation would be for them to capitulate and listen to the demands of the millions of protesters within their country and fully democratize. However, I believe that at the moment this is utterly unrealistic. At the moment, Supreme Leader Khamenei has far too much power and is obviously reluctant to relinquish it. And in the words of historian Lord Acton, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Instead, maybe in order to ease tensions within the country for the moment, and maybe unwittingly set the stage for a future democratization down the line, the government should instead undertake significant reforms that would help, that would please the protesters to a certain extent. At the moment, their hardline judicial system increases civil unrest within the country, as does police and military brutality against the protesters. By correcting these two issues, which the Supreme Leader can do fairly easily, he would vastly decrease the tension in the country and probably decrease the pressure on himself to step down. While a lot of the times the government blames the effects of U.S. sanctions, and the U.S. sanctions do upset Iranian civilians, they also blame corruption within their own government for many of the country's problems. And so a fundamental crackdown against corruption, which is obviously easier said than done, would also go a long way towards appeasing the protesters for the time being.